Sarah Mitchell adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and smoothed down her cardigan as she walked through the gates of Camp Pendleton. At 5'3" and barely weighing 110 pounds, she looked more like a librarian than someone who belonged on a military base. The morning sun caught the auburn highlights in her neatly braided hair, and she clutched a worn leather briefcase containing her credentials and research materials. The Marines at the security checkpoint exchanged glances as she approached. Her floral dress and sensible flats seemed completely out of place among the camouflage uniforms and combat boots. One guard barely suppressed a chuckle as he examined her visitor's badge, which identified her as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, specialist in combat psychology and defensive tactics. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" the younger guard asked, his tone polite but doubtful. "The main administration building is about 2 miles that way if you're looking for the Family Support Center." Sarah smiled patiently, a reaction she'd grown accustomed to over the years. "I'm here for the hand-to-hand combat assessment with Colonel Rodriguez. I believe I'm expected in Building 47. The guards looked at each other again, this time with barely concealed amusement. The senior guard shrugged and pointed toward a cluster of utilitarian buildings in the distance. "Building 47 is the combat training facility, ma'am. You sure that's where you need to be?" "Quite sure, thank you," Sarah replied, maintaining her gentle smile despite the familiar sting of assumption. She'd been dealing with these reactions her entire career, from graduate school professors who questioned her thesis on military combat effectiveness to law enforcement agencies who initially dismissed her consulting credentials. As she walked across the sprawling base, Marines in various stages of training paused their activities to stare. Some whistled appreciatively, others simply gawked at the incongruous sight of this delicate-looking woman navigating their testosterone-filled domain. Sarah kept her eyes forward, her posture straight but non-threatening, every inch the academic professional she appeared to be. Building 47 loomed ahead, a massive concrete structure that housed multiple training areas, equipment storage, and administrative offices for the combat instruction program. Through the windows, Sarah could see Marines engaged in various forms of physical training, their shouts and grunts echoing through the morning air. She paused at the entrance to check her watch. Exactly 900 hours, as requested. Sarah had always prided herself on punctuality, a trait that had served her well during her years studying martial arts in remote monasteries across Asia and training facilities throughout Europe. Those experiences had taught her that respect was earned through consistency and competence, not appearances. Inside the building, the atmosphere was intensely masculine. Motivational posters featuring combat scenarios lined the walls, and the air carried the distinct smell of sweat, determination, and military-issue cleaning products. Sarah approached the reception desk where a staff sergeant was reviewing training schedules. "Excuse me, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I have an appointment with Colonel Rodriguez regarding the Defensive Tactics Assessment Program." The staff sergeant looked up, did a double-take, then glanced down at his schedule. "You're the consultant from the university, right? The one who's supposed to evaluate our close-quarters combat protocols." "That's correct." He studied her for a long moment, clearly struggling to reconcile her appearance with her stated purpose. "Ma'am, with all due respect, are you sure you understand what this assessment involves? We're talking about hands-on evaluation of military combat techniques. It can get pretty intense." Sarah nodded understandingly. "I'm fully aware of the requirements, Sergeant. I've conducted similar assessments for law enforcement agencies across 12 states and consulted with military units in 4 different countries. I assure you, I'm prepared for whatever your Marines can demonstrate." The sergeant's expression suggested he remained unconvinced, but he dutifully picked up his phone to announce her arrival. Within minutes, Colonel Rodriguez appeared, a distinguished man in his 50s with graying temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in military service. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I have to admit, when headquarters described our new consultant, I wasn't expecting." He trailed off diplomatically. "Someone who looks like she teaches kindergarten?" Sarah suggested with a wry smile. "I get that a lot, Colonel. Shall we proceed to the evaluation area?" Colonel Rodriguez led her through a series of corridors lined with training equipment and motivational displays. They passed groups of Marines engaged in various exercises, and Sarah noticed how conversations quieted as they walked by. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes assessing her, most accompanied by expressions of confusion or barely contained amusement. "I should explain the situation," Colonel Rodriguez said as they walked. "We've been having some challenges with our hand-to-hand combat scores. Headquarters wants an outside evaluation to identify potential improvements in our training methodology. Your reputation for innovative approaches to defensive tactics precedes you." Sarah nodded. "I've reviewed your current protocols and test scores. There are definitely some areas where we can implement improvements. The key is understanding that effective combat techniques aren't always about brute force or intimidation." They arrived at a large training room equipped with padded mats, various training equipment, and observation areas. About 20 Marines were present, ranging from fresh-faced recruits to seasoned veterans with multiple deployment ribbons on their uniforms. The conversation stopped entirely as Sarah entered the room. Colonel Rodriguez called for attention. "Marines, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the university. She's here to conduct an assessment of our close quarters combat effectiveness. I want everyone to treat this evaluation seriously and demonstrate the techniques you've been learning." A collective murmur went through the group. Sarah could hear fragments of whispered conversations questioning what a little college girl could possibly teach them about fighting. She maintained her professional demeanor while internally preparing for what she knew was coming next. "Now, Dr. Mitchell," Colonel Rodriguez continued, "how would you like to proceed with the evaluation?" Sarah set down her briefcase and removed her cardigan, revealing a simple white blouse underneath. "I find that the most effective assessment method is direct observation and participation. Would it be possible to have some volunteers demonstrate the current techniques you're teaching?" Several Marines immediately stepped forward, their eagerness evident. Sarah noticed the competitive glint in their eyes and the way they sized her up, clearly relishing the opportunity to show off their skills in front of someone they perceived as an easy audience. Gunnery Sergeant Williams, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, was the first volunteer. "Ma'am, I'd be happy to demonstrate our standard restraint and takedown procedures. These techniques are designed for combat situations where lethal force isn't authorized." "Excellent," Sarah replied, beginning to roll up her sleeves. "Would you mind if I participated directly? I find hands-on experience provides the most accurate assessment of technique effectiveness." The room fell silent. Gunnery Sergeant Williams looked uncertain, glancing toward Colonel Rodriguez for guidance. The colonel himself seemed caught off guard by the request. "Dr. Mitchell," Colonel Rodriguez said carefully, "these are trained combat Marines. The techniques they're demonstrating are designed for real-world conflict situations. Perhaps observation would be more appropriate for your assessment needs." Sarah smiled the same patient smile she'd worn at the security checkpoint. "I appreciate your concern, Colonel, but I assure you I'm quite capable of handling the demonstration. In fact, direct participation will allow me to evaluate not just the techniques themselves, but their effectiveness against different body types and resistance levels." She turned to address the Marines directly. "I know this might seem unconventional, but I've found that the best way to understand the strengths and weaknesses of any combat system is to experience it firsthand. Who would like to volunteer for the first demonstration?" The Marines exchanged glances, some grinning with anticipation. This was clearly not what they'd expected from their morning training session, but the prospect of demonstrating their superior physical capabilities was too appealing to resist. Gunnery Sergeant Williams stepped onto the mat, followed by 4 other Marines who formed a semicircle around the demonstration area. The rest of the group gathered closer, clearly not wanting to miss what promised to be an entertaining show. "The standard procedure," Williams began, "involves approach, control, and restraint. The goal is to neutralize a threat without causing permanent injury." He demonstrated the basic movements slowly, showing how a larger opponent would typically overpower a smaller one through leverage and strength. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, asking technical questions about grip placement and weight distribution. To the Marines, she appeared to be taking careful mental notes, exactly what they'd expect from an academic observer. "That's very informative," Sarah said after Williams finished his demonstration. "Now, would you mind showing me how this technique works against actual resistance? I'd like to see how effective it is when the subject doesn't cooperate fully." Williams grinned confidently. "Ma'am, I have to warn you, once I apply these holds, there's not much you'll be able to do. These techniques are designed to work regardless of the subject's cooperation level. I understand completely, Sarah replied, stepping onto the mat and facing him. Please don't hold back on my account. I need to see these techniques at full effectiveness to provide an accurate assessment. Colonel Rodriguez looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but Sarah's professional credentials and confident demeanor had convinced him to allow the demonstration to proceed. He positioned himself at the edge of the mat where he could intervene if necessary. Gunnery Sergeant Williams approached Sarah with the casual confidence of someone who had executed these techniques hundreds of times against much larger opponents. At 6'2" and weighing well over 200 pounds, he had nearly a foot of height and at least 90 pounds on the diminutive consultant. The other Marines watched with interest, some already making quiet bets about how quickly the demonstration would end. To them, this was shaping up to be an amusing interlude in their regular training routine, a chance to watch their instructor politely but decisively demonstrate the reality of military combat training to an overeducated civilian. Sarah stood calmly in the center of the mat, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady and controlled. Her wire-rimmed glasses caught the fluorescent light as she gave Williams an encouraging nod. "Whenever you're ready, Gunnery Sergeant," she said in the same gentle tone she'd used throughout the morning. "Please demonstrate the technique exactly as you would in a real situation." Williams nodded and moved forward, his approach textbook perfect according to Marine Corps hand-to-hand combat protocols. He reached out to establish his initial grip, fully expecting to have the small woman secured and controlled within seconds. What happened next would be talked about in Camp Pendleton for years to come. The moment Gunnery Sergeant Williams reached for her, Sarah's entire demeanor shifted with such subtlety that most observers missed the transition entirely. Her stance altered by mere inches, her weight distribution changed almost imperceptibly, and her eyes took on a focus that seemed to catalog every detail of her opponent's approach. Williams moved with the confidence born of countless successful demonstrations. His large hands reached for Sarah's shoulders, intending to establish the grip that would allow him to demonstrate the standard restraint protocol. He was already thinking about how gently he would apply the technique, careful not to hurt the small academic who had wandered into their world. Sarah waited until his hands were committed to their trajectory, then moved. To the untrained eye, it appeared as though Williams simply lost his balance. One moment he was reaching confidently towards Sarah, and the next he was airborne, his body describing a perfect arc through the air before landing heavily on the padded mat, with a sound that echoed throughout the training room. The silence that followed was profound. Williams lay on his back, staring at the ceiling with an expression of complete bewilderment. He had felt something grab his wrist, redirect his momentum, and then the world had simply rotated around him. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Sarah stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her breathing still steady. She adjusted her glasses with one finger and looked down at the sprawled Marine with the same gentle expression she'd worn all morning. "That was very interesting," she said conversationally. "I noticed that the initial grip relies heavily on the assumption that your opponent will resist in predictable ways. What happens when they don't?" Williams rolled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. Around the room, the other Marines exchanged incredulous glances. Several laughed nervously, assuming they had just witnessed some kind of lucky accident. "That was unexpected," Colonel Rodriguez said diplomatically. "Perhaps we should continue with the assessment." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed. "I think it would be valuable to see how multiple Marines work together. Could I observe a scenario where several of you attempt to restrain a single subject?" Corporal Davis, a wiry young Marine with quick reflexes and extensive martial arts training, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I think what happened there was just a fluke. Williams probably wasn't expecting any real resistance." He glanced at his fellow Marines, who nodded in agreement. "How about I try a different approach?" Sarah smiled encouragingly. "That would be perfect for the assessment. Please proceed exactly as you would in a real situation." Davis moved more cautiously than Williams had, his training evident in every calculated step. He attempted to grab Sarah's arm while simultaneously positioning himself to avoid the type of throw that had surprised his colleague. His approach was textbook Marine Corps combatives, designed to overwhelm through superior positioning and strength. Sarah barely seemed to move. Davis found his grab attempt redirected into empty air while something struck his ankle with surgical precision. His forward momentum carried him past Sarah and directly into the wall padding, where he hit with enough force to rattle his teeth. The nervous laughter stopped entirely. "Interesting," Sarah observed, as if she were commenting on a particularly fascinating research finding. "The aggressive approach leaves several vulnerabilities. Who would like to try next?" Sergeant Peterson, a veteran with 2 combat deployments and instructor certification in hand-to-hand combat, stepped onto the mat with a grimmer expression. The casual amusement was gone now, replaced by professional curiosity mixed with wounded pride. "Ma'am," Peterson said carefully, "I think we might have underestimated your background. Would you mind sharing your training credentials before we continue?" Sarah nodded politely. "Of course. I have a doctorate in applied psychology with a specialization in conflict resolution and defensive tactics. I've studied traditional martial arts in Japan, Thailand, and the Philippines. I hold instructor certifications in several military and law enforcement combat systems, and I've consulted with special operations units in multiple countries." She paused, noticing the changing expressions around the room. "I also spent 6 years studying with masters who prefer to remain anonymous in locations that aren't typically found on university transcripts. But I find that practical demonstration is usually more informative than credentials, don't you?" Peterson approached with considerably more respect, but also with the determination of someone whose professional reputation was now on the line. He attempted a complex takedown that involved simultaneous attacks on multiple pressure points, a technique reserved for the most dangerous combat situations. Sarah met his attack with fluid precision that made the previous encounters look clumsy by comparison. She seemed to flow around his attempted strikes, redirecting his energy while adding just enough of her own to send him tumbling across the mat in a series of controlled rolls that ended with him face down and completely immobilized. "That technique shows excellent understanding of leverage points," Sarah commented as Peterson carefully extracted himself from the mat. "The execution was quite good, though there are a few modifications that might improve its effectiveness." The room had become very quiet. The Marines were no longer looking at Sarah as an amusing diversion or an academic curiosity. The way they watched her now contained a mixture of respect, wariness, and intense professional interest. Colonel Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Dr. Mitchell, I think we're beginning to understand that your background might be more extensive than initially indicated in your file." Sarah adjusted her glasses again, a gesture the Marines were beginning to recognize as significant. "I find that people respond more authentically when they're not intimidated by preconceptions. Your Marines have been demonstrating their techniques exactly as they would in real situations, which provides much more valuable assessment data." Corporal Jenkins, who had been watching from the sidelines with growing amazement, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, could you show us what we're doing wrong? I mean, those guys are some of our best fighters, and you made it look like they were beginners." "That's an excellent question," Sarah replied. "The techniques you're using are fundamentally sound, but they're designed around certain assumptions about how conflicts develop. When those assumptions don't hold, the techniques become less effective." She moved to the center of the mat, and for the first time since entering the building, Sarah allowed her true bearing to show. Her posture straightened in a way that suggested years of disciplined training. Her movement became more economical and precise, and her eyes took on the focused awareness of someone completely comfortable in combat situations. "The Marine Corps teaches excellent techniques for battlefield situations," she continued. "But those techniques assume you're facing opponents who will respond in predictable ways. When you encounter someone trained in systems that operate outside those predictions, you need to adapt." Lance Corporal Morrison, the youngest Marine present, stepped forward with the enthusiasm of someone still eager to prove himself. "Could you teach us some of those other techniques?" Sarah considered the request. "I think a demonstration would be more educational. However, I should point out that what I'm about to show you represents years of specialized training. These aren't techniques you can master in a single session." She gestured for Morrison to approach, then addressed the group. "The key difference is that traditional Asian martial arts often emphasize using your opponent's energy against them, rather than overwhelming them with your own strength. Watch how the same principle can be applied to multiple attackers simultaneously." Morrison moved toward her with the careful respect that had replaced the earlier casual confidence. Before he could establish his attack, Sarah had somehow positioned herself so that his momentum carried him directly into Corporal Davis, who had been moving to provide support. Both Marines found themselves tangled together on the mat while Sarah stood untouched a few feet away. "See how positioning allows you to use one opponent to neutralize another," she explained. "The principle scales up considerably." Sergeant Peterson, who had been watching intently, gestured to two more Marines. "Ma'am, would you mind demonstrating against multiple opponents simultaneously? For assessment purposes," he added with a slight grin that suggested he was beginning to enjoy this unexpected education. Sarah nodded. "That would provide excellent data for the evaluation. How many participants would you suggest?" The challenge in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Around the room, Marines straightened with the recognition that they were no longer dealing with a fragile academic, but with someone who represented a completely different level of combat expertise. Colonel Rodriguez looked uncertain, but the professional curiosity was clearly winning over his protective instincts. "Perhaps 3 Marines? That should provide a comprehensive demonstration of the techniques we're evaluating." Sarah smiled, and for the first time that morning, it wasn't the patient expression of someone tolerating condescension. It was the confident smile of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and was looking forward to it. "Actually," she said quietly, "I think 5 would provide a more complete assessment, if you don't mind, of course." The training room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of military exercises echoing from other parts of the building. 5 Marines stepped onto the mat, each one representing years of combat training and battlefield experience. These weren't fresh recruits or weekend warriors. They were seasoned professionals who had earned their positions through demonstrated competence in some of the most demanding military situations imaginable. Gunnery Sergeant Williams had recovered his composure and joined the group, determined to redeem himself after the earlier surprise. Sergeant Peterson cracked his knuckles methodically, his eyes never leaving Sarah as he calculated angles and timing. Corporal Davis stretched his shoulders, working out the stiffness from his encounter with the wall padding. Lance Corporal Morrison and Corporal Jenkins completed the 5-man team, both moving with the focused energy of Marines who understood they were about to participate in something unprecedented. Colonel Rodriguez positioned himself where he could observe clearly while remaining ready to intervene if the demonstration went too far. The remaining Marines formed a loose circle around the mat, their earlier casual amusement replaced by intense professional interest. Word was spreading quickly through the building, and more personnel were quietly filtering into the training room. Sarah stood in the center of the mat, still wearing her simple white blouse and dark slacks, her wire-rimmed glasses catching the fluorescent lights. She had removed her sensible flats, revealing that she wore no socks underneath. Her bare feet seemed to grip the mat with unusual familiarity, and her stance had subtly shifted to something that suggested deep roots in traditional martial arts training. "The scenario," Sarah announced in her calm, academic voice, "will simulate a situation where multiple opponents attempt to subdue a single target using standard military restraint techniques. I want each of you to approach this exactly as you would a real combat situation. Don't hold back because of my size or gender. The assessment requires authentic technique demonstration." Williams nodded grimly. "Ma'am, we understand, but I want to make sure you understand what you're asking for. 5 trained Marines working together can subdue pretty much anyone. This isn't going to be like the individual demonstrations." Sarah adjusted her glasses one final time and smiled. "I'm counting on it, Gunnery Sergeant. The individual techniques were informative, but I need to see how your training handles coordination against an adaptive opponent." The 5 Marines spread out around her in a loose pentagon formation, each one positioned to attack from a different angle while supporting his teammates. Their movement was practiced and professional, the result of countless hours training together in various combat scenarios. They communicated through subtle gestures and eye contact, coordinating their approach with the efficiency that marked elite military units. Peterson raised his hand, and the others tensed in preparation. Sarah's breathing remained steady and controlled, her eyes tracking all 5 opponents simultaneously with an awareness that suggested she was processing far more information than seemed possible for a single person to manage. "Execute," Peterson called out. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed by military instructors for years afterward, though witnesses would struggle to describe exactly what they had seen. The 5 Marines moved as a unit, their attack coordinated to overwhelm Sarah through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Williams and Davis approached from opposite sides while Peterson came straight forward. Morrison and Jenkins moved to cut off escape routes while preparing to provide backup restraint once the initial contact was established. Sarah seemed to dissolve. That was the only way the observers could describe it afterward. One moment she was standing in the center of the mat as 5 trained Marines converged on her position, and the next moment the Marines were converging on empty space, while Sarah had somehow relocated herself to a position that put all 5 attackers between her and their own teammates. Williams, who had been reaching for where Sarah's shoulders should have been, instead found himself grabbing Peterson's outstretched arm. The sudden, unexpected contact threw off Peterson's timing, causing him to stumble forward into Davis, who was executing his own attack from the opposite direction. Morrison, trying to adjust to Sarah's new position, collided with Jenkins as both Marines attempted to redirect their approach. In the space of 3 seconds, the coordinated 5-man attack had dissolved into a confused tangle of friendly collisions and misdirected momentum, and Sarah hadn't even touched any of them yet. Interesting, she observed from her new position. The coordination relies on predictable target behavior. What happens when that prediction fails? The Marines separated and regrouped, their expressions now showing a mixture of embarrassment and dawning respect. They had trained for years to execute that coordinated approach, and it had been neutralized by someone who simply hadn't been where they expected her to be. Again, Peterson ordered, his voice tighter now. Adapt to her movement patterns. This time they approached more cautiously, with each Marine ready to adjust based on Sarah's reactions. Williams moved first, attempting to force Sarah into a position where the others could control her movement options. Davis came in from the opposite angle while Peterson positioned himself to intercept any attempt to slip between the attackers. Sarah waited until they were committed to their positions, then moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics. She stepped into Williams's attack instead of away from it, using his own momentum to redirect him into Davis while simultaneously striking pressure points that caused both Marines' arms to go numb. Peterson found himself facing not Sarah, but Williams and Davis stumbling directly toward him. Morrison and Jenkins, approaching from the flanks, discovered that their target had somehow positioned the other 3 Marines between herself and their attack angles. When they tried to adjust, they found Sarah moving again, always staying just ahead of their coordination while using their own teammates as obstacles. The second attempt lasted less than 10 seconds before all 5 Marines were on the ground, not from powerful strikes or throws, but from a series of precise redirections that had turned their coordinated attack into a case study in friendly fire collision dynamics. Colonel Rodriguez stepped closer to the mat, his expression showing professional fascination mixed with concern. Dr. Mitchell, I think we're beginning to understand that your expertise might extend beyond traditional academic assessment. Sarah helped Morrison to his feet, her touch gentle despite the devastating effectiveness of her defensive techniques. The assessment is providing excellent data, Colonel. Your Marines' techniques are fundamentally sound, but they're designed around assumptions that don't always hold in real-world situations. Williams struggled to his feet, shaking his head to clear it. Ma'am, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen movement like that. Where did you learn those techniques? Various places, Sarah replied diplomatically. Some in academic settings, some in less formal environments. The key principle is that effective self-defense isn't about overpowering your opponents, but about understanding and redirecting their intentions. Jenkins, who was nursing a bruised shoulder from his collision with Morrison, raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, could you show us how to counter what you just did? I mean, there has to be some way to adjust our tactics. Sarah considered the question seriously. There are adaptations, certainly, but they require understanding some fundamental principles that aren't typically covered in standard military combatives training. The techniques I'm using come from systems that were developed specifically to allow smaller defenders to survive against multiple larger attackers. She gestured for the Marines to gather around her. Your training emphasizes strength, aggression, and overwhelming force. Those are excellent approaches when you have superior numbers or physical advantages. But when you're facing someone trained in evasion and redirection, those same strengths can become vulnerabilities. Davis wiped sweat from his forehead, though Sarah showed no signs of exertion despite having neutralized 10 coordinated attacks in the past 15 minutes. "Ma'am, are you saying our training is wrong?" "Not wrong," Sarah clarified. "Incomplete. Military combat training is designed for battlefield scenarios where you're typically armed and working with teammates against armed opponents. The techniques work excellently in those contexts, but hand-to-hand combat presents different challenges that require different solutions." Peterson stepped back onto the mat with renewed determination. "Ma'am, with respect, I think we just need to adjust our approach. Could we try one more time with modifications based on what we've observed?" Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that makes Marines effective. What modifications did you have in mind?" The 5 Marines huddled briefly, their conversation punctuated by gestures and tactical sketches drawn in the air. When they separated, their formation was different, more spread out, and with contingency positions that hadn't been evident in their previous attempts. "We're going to try a more flexible approach," Williams announced. "Less coordination, more individual adaptation. If you neutralize one of us, the others adjust independently rather than trying to maintain a predetermined pattern." "Excellent thinking," Sarah approved. "That addresses one of the key vulnerabilities I observed. Shall we proceed?" This time, the Marines approached with the wariness of professionals who had learned to respect their opponent. Their movements were more conservative, more ready to adapt when their initial approaches failed. They had learned from their mistakes and were applying that knowledge systematically. Sarah watched them come, and for the first time since entering the building, she allowed her full capabilities to show. Her stance shifted into something that spoke of decades spent perfecting techniques that most Westerners had never heard of, much less seen in action. The final demonstration was about to begin. The atmosphere in the training room had completely transformed. What had started as casual curiosity about an academic consultant had evolved into something approaching reverence. More Marines had quietly filtered into the observation area, and even some officers from other units had appeared, drawn by reports of the unusual demonstration taking place in Building 47. Sarah stood at the center of the mat, but everything about her bearing had changed. Gone was the tentative academic posture and the apologetic smile. In its place stood someone who moved with the unconscious confidence of a master practitioner, every gesture economical and purposeful. Her breathing remained steady, but there was an alertness about her that suggested capabilities far beyond what anyone in the room had initially suspected. The 5 Marines approached with the careful respect they might show a confirmed dangerous opponent. Their earlier casual coordination had been replaced by tactical spacing and cautious movement. Williams took point position, but stayed ready to react rather than initiate. Peterson and Davis flanked wide, giving themselves room to adapt based on Sarah's responses. Morrison and Jenkins held back positions, ready to exploit any opportunities that developed. "Remember," Peterson called quietly to his teammates, "she uses our momentum against us. Stay mobile, don't commit fully to any single attack, and watch for redirections." Sarah nodded approvingly at their tactical discussion. "Excellent adaptation. You're beginning to understand the principles involved. Now let's see how well you can implement them." Williams moved first, but instead of the aggressive charge that had characterized their earlier attempts, he approached with a series of feints and probes, testing Sarah's reactions without fully committing to any single line of attack. His caution proved wise as Sarah's responses demonstrated a level of anticipation that suggested she was reading his intentions several moves in advance. Davis came in from the right flank while Williams maintained pressure from the front, but both Marines stayed mobile, ready to disengage if their attacks were redirected. Sarah flowed between their approaches like water, never quite where they expected her to be, always a half step ahead of their coordination. Peterson attempted to time his attack to Sarah's defensive movements, trying to catch her while she was focused on his teammates. It was a sound, tactical decision that demonstrated real understanding of the lessons from their previous encounters. Sarah acknowledged the improvement by actually engaging with his attack rather than simply avoiding it. The engagement lasted exactly 4 seconds. Peterson found his carefully planned strike redirected into a throw that sent him sliding across the mat. But Sarah had used the momentum of that redirection to position herself for simultaneous attacks on Williams and Davis. Both Marines discovered that their tactical spacing, which should have protected them from each other's interference, had instead created perfect angles for Sarah to use their own movements against them. Williams hit the mat hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. Davis managed to stay on his feet, but found his right arm completely numb from a pressure point strike he never saw coming. Peterson rolled with his landing and came up ready to continue, demonstrating the kind of resilience that had made him an instructor, but he was already out of effective fighting position. Morrison and Jenkins, who had been waiting for their opportunity, moved with textbook precision to exploit what should have been Sarah's momentary vulnerability while she dealt with the other three Marines. They had calculated their timing perfectly, approaching from angles that should have been impossible for her to defend simultaneously. Sarah met their coordinated attack with a technique that none of the Marines had ever seen before. Instead of trying to defend against both attackers, she seemed to flow directly between them, using their own attack vectors as pathways to position that put both Marines between herself and each other. Morrison's strike, intended for Sarah's center mass, instead caught Jenkins across the chest. Jenkins's attempted grab found Morrison's arm instead of their intended target. The collision sent both Marines to the mat in a tangle of limbs and confusion while Sarah emerged from between them completely untouched. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds and demonstrated a level of spatial awareness and tactical thinking that left the observers struggling to process what they had witnessed. 5 Marines lay on the training mat, not from devastating strikes or overwhelming force, but from a series of precise redirections and positioning moves that had turned their own coordination and training against them. Sarah stood in the center of the mat, her breathing still controlled, not even a hair out of place despite having just neutralized a coordinated attack by 5 trained military professionals. The silence in the training room was profound. Some of the observing Marines were shaking their heads in disbelief. Others were taking notes on technique details they hoped to analyze later. Colonel Rodriguez stood at the edge of the mat with the expression of someone watching his fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness being systematically dismantled. Williams rolled to a sitting position, his expression mixing respect with professional curiosity. "Ma'am, in 15 years of military service, including combat deployments and specialized training, I've never encountered anything like what you just demonstrated. Those weren't techniques from any manual I've ever studied." Sarah helped Peterson to his feet with the same gentle care she might show a child who had taken a tumble. The techniques come from systems that were developed over centuries, specifically for situations where practitioners faced multiple opponents with superior size and strength. The underlying principles are actually quite simple, though the implementation requires considerable practice. Davis flexed his fingers experimentally as sensation returned to his arm. "Simple principles? Ma'am, what you just did looked like something from a martial arts movie, except it was real." "The principle," Sarah explained, adjusting her glasses in a gesture that the Marines now recognized as significant, "is that every attack creates vulnerabilities in the attacker. When you have multiple attackers, those vulnerabilities multiply and interact in predictable ways. If you understand the patterns, you can use the attacker's coordination against them." She gestured to the mat where chalk marks from earlier training still outlined practice areas. "Your military training teaches you to overwhelm opposition through superior force and coordination. That works excellently when you have those advantages. But when you're the smaller force, you need different strategies." Morrison struggled to his feet, nursing a bruised shoulder from his collision with Jenkins. "Ma'am, could you teach us some of those strategies? I mean, there might be situations where we face superior numbers or need to subdue opponents without using lethal force." "That's exactly why I was asked to conduct this assessment," Sarah replied. "Your current training is excellent for its intended purposes, but there are gaps that could be addressed with supplementary instruction in defensive tactics." Colonel Rodriguez stepped onto the mat, his expression showing the kind of professional interest that suggested policy changes were already forming in his mind. "Dr. Mitchell, I think it's safe to say that your assessment has revealed some areas where our training could be enhanced. Would you be available to develop a supplementary curriculum?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the demonstrations began, it was the warm, academic expression she had worn when entering the building. "I would be honored to contribute to your training program, Colonel," There are techniques that could significantly enhance your Marine's effectiveness in close-quarters situations, particularly those involving civilian populations or situations where lethal force isn't authorized. Jenkins raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, one question. You said these techniques took years to master. How long would it take us to learn enough to be useful? That depends on your definition of useful, Sarah replied thoughtfully. The basic principles can be understood in a few weeks. Developing real proficiency takes months of regular practice. Achieving mastery is a lifetime pursuit, but even basic competency in these techniques would significantly expand your tactical options. She looked around the room at the faces that had transformed from skeptical amusement to respectful attention. The most important lesson is understanding that effective combat isn't always about being the strongest or most aggressive. Sometimes it's about being the smartest, the most adaptable, or the most aware of opportunities that others miss. Williams got to his feet and extended his hand to Sarah, his expression showing genuine respect. Ma'am, I owe you an apology for my initial assumptions. I've learned more about combat effectiveness in the past hour than I have in years of standard training. Sarah shook his hand with a grip that, the Marines now realized, probably contained far more strength than her delicate appearance suggested. No apology necessary, Gunnery Sergeant. First impressions are natural, and I've found that the most effective teaching often begins with challenging expectations. The demonstration was complete, but its implications were only beginning to be understood. Word of what had happened in Building 47 would spread throughout Camp Pendleton within hours, launching discussions about training methods, combat effectiveness, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances that would continue for months. Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave, but she knew she would be back. The Marine Corps had just discovered that their understanding of hand-to-hand combat had some significant gaps, and they were too professional an organization to ignore those discoveries. As she walked toward the exit, the Marine stepped aside with a respect that had been completely absent from her arrival that morning. Behind her, animated discussions were already beginning about technique analysis, training modifications, and the implications of what they had witnessed. The fragile academic consultant was leaving, but she was taking with her every assumption about combat effectiveness that the Marines had held when she arrived. 3 months later, Building 47 had become one of the most requested training facilities on Camp Pendleton. The transformation was evident from the moment visitors entered the building. New training equipment lined the walls, including traditional martial arts apparatus that had never been seen in military facilities. Motivational posters now shared space with philosophical quotes about adapting to circumstances and using intelligence over force. Sarah had returned every Tuesday and Thursday for 12 weeks, each session building on techniques that challenged everything the Marines thought they knew about hand-to-hand combat. The initial skepticism had evolved into something approaching reverence as word of the training program spread throughout the base and beyond. Colonel Rodriguez stood at the entrance to the main training room, reviewing reports from other military installations that had requested information about Camp Pendleton's new defensive tactics curriculum. The requests were coming from Army bases, Navy facilities, and even some special operations units that rarely acknowledged the existence of anything they hadn't developed themselves. Sir, Gunnery Sergeant Williams approached with the confident bearing of someone whose professional world had been expanded considerably over the past 3 months. Dr. Mitchell is ready for today's assessment demonstration. The visiting instructors are in position. Williams himself had been transformed by the training program. His approach to combat instruction now emphasized awareness and adaptation over brute force application. His students consistently scored higher on tactical assessments, and their performance in real-world situations had improved dramatically. The change in his teaching methodology had become a model for other instructors throughout the Marine Corps. The training room contained 30 Marines in various stages of the new curriculum, along with a dozen visiting instructors from other branches of the military. In the center of the room, Sarah stood wearing her customary simple attire, though the Marines no longer saw her as fragile or academic. They saw her as Professor Mitchell, a title that carried more weight in their minds than most military ranks. Today's demonstration, Sarah announced to the assembled group, will involve practical application of defensive principles in realistic scenarios. The goal is to show how these techniques integrate with existing military training rather than replacing it. She gestured to a group of 6 Marines who stepped onto the mat. These weren't the same Marines who had originally volunteered for her first assessment. These were students who had completed the full 12-week curriculum and understood the principles behind the techniques they were about to demonstrate. Sergeant Peterson will coordinate a standard restraint scenario, Sarah continued. The difference is that his team will be using the enhanced tactics we've been developing, while I represent a target who hasn't had access to our training. Peterson, who had become one of Sarah's most devoted students, nodded grimly. His understanding of combat dynamics had evolved considerably since their first encounter. He now taught classes on tactical awareness that drew attendees from throughout the Marine Corps, and his insights were being incorporated into official training manuals. The 6 Marines approached Sarah with movements that were recognizably military, but modified by principles they had learned over the past 3 months. Their coordination was more fluid, more responsive to changing conditions. Instead of overwhelming force, they emphasized positioning, timing, and adaptation. Sarah defended herself using only the techniques that had been standard Marine Corps doctrine 3 months earlier, demonstrating how a conventionally trained opponent would respond to their enhanced tactics. The result was striking. The Marines neutralized her defensive attempts with an efficiency that made their previous struggles seem almost comical in comparison. "Excellent demonstration," Sarah announced as she helped the Marines to their feet. "Notice how understanding the underlying principles allowed you to adapt your existing techniques rather than replacing them entirely." She turned to address the visiting instructors, who had been taking notes throughout the demonstration. "The key insight is that effective combat training isn't about learning new techniques as much as understanding why existing techniques work and how to modify them when circumstances change." Major Sarah Chen from the Army's Special Forces Training Command raised her hand. "Dr. Mitchell, we've heard reports that your students are showing improved performance in all areas of combat training, not just hand-to-hand combat. Can you explain how that's possible?" Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The principles we teach here aren't really about fighting techniques. They're about awareness, adaptation, and using available resources more efficiently. Those same principles apply whether you're engaged in close quarters combat, tactical planning, or equipment maintenance." She gestured to Lance Corporal Morrison, who had become one of her most dedicated students. "Morrison, would you explain how the awareness training has affected your other duties?" Morrison stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had found practical application for abstract concepts. "Ma'am, the spatial awareness techniques help with everything from vehicle maintenance to patrol movements. Understanding how systems interact and being able to anticipate problems has improved my performance across all my duties." The visiting instructors exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand why this program had generated so much attention throughout the military hierarchy. This wasn't just about adding new combat techniques to existing training. It was about enhancing the cognitive abilities that made Marines more effective in all their roles. Captain Williams from the Navy SEAL training program had been observing quietly throughout the demonstration. "Dr. Mitchell, our preliminary reports suggest that Marines who complete your program show improved decision-making under stress across a wide range of scenarios. Is that intentional?" "Absolutely," Sarah replied. "The techniques we practice here require constant assessment of changing conditions and rapid adaptation to new information. Those are exactly the cognitive skills that enhance performance in high-stress military situations." She moved to a whiteboard that hadn't been present during her first visit to Building 47 and began sketching diagrams that illustrated the decision-making processes underlying the techniques they had been demonstrating. "Traditional combat training focuses on physical techniques and predetermined responses," she explained. "Our approach emphasizes developing the ability to assess situations rapidly and adapt responses based on real-time information. The physical techniques are just a vehicle for teaching those cognitive skills." Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward with the expression of someone who had seen his expectations consistently exceeded over the past 3 months. "Dr. Mitchell, Headquarters has requested a formal report on the program's effectiveness. The preliminary data suggests performance improvements that go beyond anything we initially expected." Sarah smiled with the satisfaction of an educator whose students had exceeded even her optimistic projections. The Marines who have completed this program demonstrate enhanced tactical thinking, improved stress response, and better team coordination. More importantly, they understand principles they can continue to develop throughout their careers. She turned to address the room full of Marines who represented her first class of students. The real test of any educational program is whether students can continue learning and improving after the formal instruction ends. From what I've observed, you've all internalized the principles well enough to keep developing these skills independently. Gunnery Sergeant Williams raised his hand with the respect he might show a senior officer. Ma'am, speaking for the Marines who went through your program, I can say that it's changed how we approach every aspect of our duties. We're better Marines because we're better thinkers. The visiting instructors were already discussing implementation timelines and resource requirements among themselves. What had started as an assessment of hand-to-hand combat effectiveness had evolved into something approaching a revolution in military training philosophy. Sarah gathered her materials as the formal demonstration concluded, but the discussions were just beginning. Groups of Marines and visiting instructors clustered around technique demonstrations, philosophical debates about training methodology, and practical questions about implementation in different military contexts. As she prepared to leave, Sarah reflected on how completely the atmosphere had changed since her first visit. The initial skepticism about the fragile academic consultant had been replaced by genuine respect for Professor Mitchell, whose unassuming appearance concealed capabilities that had challenged fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness. The Marines no longer saw her departure as the end of a training session, but as a temporary pause in an ongoing educational relationship that had transformed their understanding of their own potential. They had learned that true strength came not from overwhelming opposition, but from understanding it well enough to redirect it toward constructive purposes. Behind her, the animated discussions continued as Marines compared notes, analyzed techniques, and planned how to integrate their new understanding into their regular duties. The fragile academic consultant had accomplished something that traditional military instructors rarely achieved. She had taught her students to teach themselves. Building 47 would continue to attract visitors from military installations around the world, all seeking to understand how a small woman in wire-rimmed glasses had managed to revolutionize combat training by teaching Marines that the most dangerous opponent was often the one who didn't look dangerous at all. The lesson extended far beyond martial arts techniques. In a world where appearances often determined assumptions, Sarah Mitchell had proven that capability, intelligence, and effectiveness could exist in forms that challenged every preconception. She had shown that true strength was measured not by the ability to overpower opposition, but by the wisdom to make opposition unnecessary. The Marines would remember that lesson long after they left Camp Pendleton, carrying it to assignments around the world where they would face challenges that required exactly the kind of adaptive thinking and principled response that Professor Mitchell had taught them to develop. The fragile woman who had dropped 5 Marines without breaking a sweat had given them something far more valuable than combat techniques. She had given them a new understanding of what it meant to be truly formidable.